Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. Our topic today is psychology and spirituality, and my guest, Dr. Frances Vaughan, is a clinical psychologist and an author of several books, including The Inward Arc and Intuition. Frances, welcome.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here, Jeff.
You write extensively about spirituality in your work, and as the former president of the Association for Transpersonal Psychology, you really have an extensive professional interest in the interface between spirituality and psychology. And this is an area which fascinates many people and also confuses a lot of people, I think, because spirituality is often associated with so many dogmas. How does psychology, what is the role of psychology as opposed to the role of religion in helping people to develop spiritually?
Well, the way I see it is that traditional psychology tends to take a very dim view of spirituality because psychology tends to see many people trying to avoid issues of personal confrontation with by turning to spirituality.
Sort of head in the clouds,
Yes.
airy-fairy, avoiding the gut feelings
Exactly.
kind of criticisms.
Or finding a kind of escape from the realities, the existential realities of our mortality, our aloneness, and the situation, the human condition. And in other words, a lot of times psychologists will see spirituality as a kind of escapism or something that people believe in order to make themselves feel better. And
on the converse, it almost seems to me that you have a lot of religions describing psychology in those same terms.
Yes.
The fundamentalists feel that psychology is sort of a fantasy, that they're avoiding the real issues.
Exactly. So that they tend to take that view, an oppositional stance.
Yes.
Traditional spiritual teachers, for example, or traditional religions often see psychology as simply concerned with the ego, selfishness, and they fail to see the value of that in terms of personal growth or healthy personal development.
Yeah.
So
or at least not dealing with real values.
Yes. And so I think there's a lot of education that needs to happen on both sides because, in fact, I see them as complementary aspects of human development, both of which are necessary for wholeness and for real healing in our lives. So I feel that there needs to be a lot of bridging work between the two so that people don't feel that they have to choose either a psychological discipline or a spiritual discipline, but that in fact both are important.
Now, in your work, what I've noticed is that you've drawn from many traditions. You've looked at the Christian spiritual path, you've looked at Zen, Buddhism, you've looked at yoga, and a number of others in your writings. And you seem to be saying that they all point in the same direction, don't you?
Well, I like the analogy of truth as a mountain, with all the different religious paths as different approaches to climbing the mountain, so that you see many different paths up the mountain, and when you're down in the lower slopes you may argue about the shape of the mountain, but the more you work on it and the further up you go, the more you see that there's a convergence, that there are certain values, for example, that tend to be common to all different traditions, and that even though different paths provide different experiences along the way, I feel very strongly that there is a universal experience of self-transcendence that's possible, and that in fact this can be very healing for people. It can have a very positive effect in terms of their psychological development if such an experience is appropriately integrated.
A universal quality of self-transcendence.
Yes.
That's sort of putting it in a nutshell, isn't it? How does that translate, say, to a therapy practice when you're working with someone?
Well, in my practice, I find that sometimes people seek me out because they know I have a transpersonal orientation, And particularly if they've had some kind of experience that has opened up some spiritual issues for them, or if perhaps if they've been practicing meditation and they want to talk things over with someone who has an understanding of the practice and what those experiences might be like. Or they may have had some kind of spontaneous opening and had an experience of self-transcendence that they want to make sense out of, that they want to integrate in some way.
Is it something that people need to seek? I mean, if a person came to you and they're having marital problems or some other type of conventional psychological problem and they don't have a thought about spiritual experience, is there any application there?
Well, my experience is that it depends how deeply people want to do inner work, because often people will come into therapy seeking relief for some kind of interpersonal stress. You know, some relationship issue is very common, for example, either marital problem or a breakup of a relationship. And but sooner or later, I think everyone has to confront themselves. And that very often in relationships, we tend to think, well, if only the other person were different, then everything would be all right. But ultimately, I think we have to take a look at what we're contributing and how we can make a difference in terms of the quality of relationships that we have in our lives. And so as soon as we start to do this, as soon as we look at how it is that our state of being or our state of consciousness affects the relationships that we tend to bring into our lives, that the patterns that we find ourselves
Can you give me an
recreating.
example of this? Is there an illustration, maybe to make it a little more concrete?
For example, I recently have been working with a woman who is in her second marriage, and she separated from her first husband because of he had a problem with alcohol, and she felt that it was all his problem. Well, she found that she was recreating similar patterns in her second marriage. And the second time around, she didn't want to just leave. She wanted to stay in the relationship and work through some of her own issues with it.
In other words, she thought she might get rid of the problem by getting rid of the first husband.
Exactly, exactly. And of course it never works, because as soon as you get rid of the relationship, you find that you either recreate a similar relationship or you have to deal with the same issues in yourself.
It's like Pogo, who once said, "We have found the enemy and he is us."
Yes, and I think that that's one place where spirituality and psychology converge, because we recognize that we're all mirrors for each other in some way. I see that, for example, in some way all of my clients reflect aspects of myself. I can empathize with them because I know how it feels to be in the kinds of situations that they describe.
That's almost essential for a therapist, really, isn't it?
Well, I think it's something that's really available to all of us. That the more we're willing to look at ourselves and understand the dynamics of the way the mind works, the more we realize that these are really universal patterns, and that people everywhere have to deal with issues of love and fear and anxiety about loss and facing death. And often it's just at these times when people feel some kind of crisis in their lives, maybe facing their own mortality or the death of someone that they're close to, that's when spiritual issues become really meaningful and important.
Now, in the case of this particular woman that you just mentioned, how did she begin to look at spiritual issues?
Well, basically, it was a question of values in her life. It's what were the things that really were most important to her. And what she came to see was that in order to really love her partner and the person she was with, she also had to take herself into account. And this is often true, that it's not a matter of either loving oneself or loving someone else. It seems to be both. Both are necessary. So I sometimes think of spirituality or spiritual disciplines as teaching us to forgive others, and psychotherapy as a way of learning to forgive ourselves.
That's a very interesting distinction. You, in your work, you sort of describe the self as if it were an onion with different layers. And there's an existential level of the self, there's an ego level, there's a transpersonal level. Could we go through the onion a little bit and sort of see it from your eyes?
All right. Well, I like to use the image of concentric circles because I think that as we become more conscious and more aware of the nature of the self, the sense of self expands, so that when we're afraid or when we're unwilling to be in touch with the world around us, our sense of self gets constricted and smaller. So first of all, I see it in a developmental framework. I see that we are usually primarily identified with the body, the physical self. Then we also become aware of our feelings. We get a sense of the emotional self, the mental self, our thoughts about feelings. We even start to think about thinking.
So
at a
the
certain
first
stage.
three layers would be physical, emotional, and mental.
Right, and those have been mapped by Western psychology very thoroughly. The areas that haven't been mapped so clearly are the ones that go beyond ego. That is, the ego is generally referred to as that what we think we are. The ideas about our identity in terms of roles and relationships and
The mask or the persona.
yes, that's part of it. And then the existential self is what we generally get in touch with when we become concerned about authenticity.
So
When
that's-
it's not enough to have a good image or to play a role, but it really matters if you feel that you're authentic, a sense of integrity, a sense of choice, a sense of having your inner experience match your outer expression so that there isn't that split between the two. This would be a sense of a healthy existential self.
And a good deal of contemporary psychology begins and ends right there, I suppose.
Oh, yes, and I have great appreciation for the contribution of the existential psychologists such as Rollo May, James Bugenthal, and some of the people who have really pointed out the importance of coming to terms with the existential issues of value, meaning, and purpose in our lives. And then there's another area, though, because with the existential view, we're only isolated, individual, separate entities in the world, existing usually in a state of alienation in our lives.
It reminds me of Camus' famous book, Nausea, I think. Or
Well,
was
that was Sartre,
Oh,
yes.
okay.
Yes, but both Camus and Sartre are certainly gave us a good exposure to that point of view.
Camus and Sartre and Genet, the sense one gets from these existential writers is that when you really get in touch with life as it is, it will make you sick.
Well, and because the ultimate reality there is the idea that we're separated and alone. However, it seems to me that there's another side to experience which is just as valid, which is that we're all connected. And that, yes, we have the experience of being separate and alone, but we also have the experience of being connected to each other, to the environment, and that we're not just independent, we're also interdependent. So that as soon as we start recognizing how we all exist in this intricate network of mutually interdependent relationships, then I think that we wake up to the possibility of another kind of awareness that transcends the existential separateness.
So we're moving beyond the existential here into,
This is-
I would think of this as sort of a systems approach.
Yes.
We're beginning to look at networking or
Yes, exactly. Yes.
seeing human beings as like analogous to cells of the body. Or
Yes.
the social structure could be thought of as like a body.
Yes.
In that sense. But it's also transpersonal.
It is, and it's what Ken Wilber has called vision logic, which is looking not only at ideas and how beliefs affect experience, but also at networks of ideas and how we become more creative in terms of the way we view ourselves and the planet as a whole. It's a more global view, if you will, which tries to take into account not only the individual in isolation, but also in relationship to the larger whole, both in relationship to the society as well as in relationship to the environment.
Now, Frances, you're an expert on intuition. You've written a book on intuition. When we get beyond the existential self, the agony and the loneliness, well, I'm thinking of the creative process. How many artists do we hear about who struggle and they experience this alienation, and then they have this breakthrough, and what comes out of it is, you know, the music of Mozart or Wagner, or the, you know, the great creativity. Now, that's not the same as what we've described as this networking phenomenon of people. That's a different level also, isn't it?
it is a different level, and I think that intuition is often associated with inspiration and insight. And again, it's a kind of self-transcendence in that something seems to come through us rather than being a product of something that the ego invents. In other words, once we learn to be quiet, to quiet the mind, and this is where we can learn something from some of the Eastern disciplines, is that learning to quiet the mind opens up all kinds of creative possibilities. And that seems to be something that psychology needs to investigate, I think, in more depth. And also that what we believe to be true about this process tends to become true in our experience.
We create our own psychology.
Well, we
so to
certainly create our own inner experience by our beliefs about it. So I think that it's an appropriate task for psychology to investigate these experiences and to understand more the role of beliefs in generating our experience, and also in terms of what it means for psychological health.
How do you define the term transpersonal? I think we were kind of getting at it, and I've added this dimension. We've discussed intuition, creativity, and the sense that there's a larger part of us that's not totally separate, that we're connected with other people. Am I missing something?
Well, sometimes we say transpersonal means beyond the personal. But it's also, I think, refers to the transcendental as expressed in and through the personal, so that it's the link between the personal and that which is transcendent. And again, it's a psychological view of spiritual development rather than a religious point of view. So the transpersonal psychology doesn't espouse any particular religious orientation, but it tries to understand the universal human experience that leads to different paths of exploration.
Now, transpersonal psychologists have been accused, say by the existentialists such as Rollo May, of being advocates of religion and not practicing psychology at all. But, you know, your clients come to you and they meditate in a full lotus posture that you should really be wearing orange robes or something instead of a business suit. How do you respond to that?
Well, that's not my experience at all. That as the way I see it, and I've certainly had opportunity to talk to a lot of transpersonal psychologists actually all over the world, and they are indeed psychologists, and some of them have a particular religious affiliation and some do not, but I don't know that any of them would try to convert anybody or impose their beliefs on their clients. If the functioning or working as a psychologist means, I think, maintaining a certain objectivity, if you will, or at least putting the client's interests ahead of your own, whatever your beliefs may be.
Well, there's this enormous movement in modern, so-called modern psychology, that is everything we do as psychologists must be scientific. It should be researched. It should be experimented. And we should always never go beyond the bounds of what the experiments say as scientific psychologists. And yet, as I read your writing and the writing of other transpersonal psychologists, the sense is that the science that you're looking to is not experimental science. It's the accumulated wisdom of people who have practiced meditation and spiritual disciplines and have reported phenomenologically on that.
Well, I think that we do need more investigation. I think that more research would be an excellent contribution to the field, that in fact that's something where there's a lot of work to be done yet. But in fact there's considerable data to say that there are methods of training awareness, of training the mind, that have worked very well in other cultures that we could learn something from.
It's almost as if I could describe you in a way as a psychologist. I mean, for people who have kind of mastered the Western traditions, the scientific literature, the existential, the social, all the issues of alcoholism and child abuse, and now they're looking for something more in their lives, they begin to wonder about the spiritual dimension, and yet many people in the modern world can't really, religion is unpalatable to them. So do you sort of serve as a substitute priest in that sense?
In a sense, perhaps that's so, because I think it's too bad that if a person doesn't feel comfortable with conventional religion, that they should not have the opportunity to do the inner work and to find out for themselves their own connections to that inner source of wisdom or that sense of relatedness. It may or may not be a sense of connection to God. Depends. Some religious traditions, such as the Zen Buddhist, for example, are not theistic at all. But nevertheless, they have a lot to contribute to spiritual development and to values in one's life.
It's almost as if I recall reading a Carl Sagan novel recently, and he describes the Buddhist practice as saying the Buddhist God is so great he doesn't even need to exist.
Well, I think we get into a question of semantics, whether we talk about God or no God. It's the same thing happens in psychological language, talking about the self and no self. And we do sometimes have experiences of oneness, which might be called experiences of the one self. And sometimes we have experiences of the void, which might be called experiences of no self. So I think that we need to be careful not to get too bogged down in oppositional language, because I think we are talking about a universal experience, or the potentiality for it anyway.
And in your work, you've had a chance to study the phenomenological, personal, autobiographical reports of mystics of many different religions, and
Yes.
you've come to realize similar patterns, I think.
Yes, I think there are certainly universal experiences. And I always like to look for the transcendental unity of religions, but from a psychological perspective, I sort of take the psychological viewing frame. It's as though, it seems to me that we can't not take some type of viewing frame if we're going to say anything at all. So we need to speak in a particular language, and as soon as we say anything, we're already taking a position. And it seems to me that psychological language offers a way of exploration and investigation that is not already kind of predetermined by a long tradition of particular religious views.
You know, one of the most intriguing areas in the interface between spirituality and psychology is the notion of kundalini, that perhaps some people who we would define in our traditional Western sense as going crazy, having a nervous breakdown or a psychotic break or becoming schizophrenic, from another perspective, they may be experiencing a spiritual awakening, a spiritual breakthrough. Is this part of what you deal with in your practice?
Well, I think the real issue here is to say what happens when you have an experience that you can't account for in terms of ordinary psychology, if you will. And I think that there are two possible hazards here. One is to pathologize experiences that might, in fact, be an opportunity for a larger
because they have these
sense of
categories in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychologists, which say,
Right.
you know, if you can't think of anything else, it's some form of undifferentiated schizophrenia.
Right. And I don't think that's always true.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think that on the other side, there's also the hazard of romanticizing all experiences that are in some way involving the dissolution of ego boundaries as being breakthroughs or transpersonal. And
God
I think that
intoxication.
yes, and I think that there are both kinds. There are breakdowns and there are breakthroughs. And that as psychologists, we need to know the difference.
How do you do that?
Well, there are definitely certain characteristics that are typical, say, of pre-personal experiences and characteristics typical of transpersonal experiences. The pre-personal, for example, are generally regressive, and they generally have a lot of fear associated with them. And there's the sense of the reality that's perceived at the moment seems to be the only reality, the only possible reality. It's a kind of constriction of consciousness.
You use the term pre-personal?
Yes.
What does that mean?
Well, when we take a developmental frame, we talk about pre-personal development. That's before you become fully self-aware of your own ego identity. And we talk about personal, and then transpersonal. So that I think one of the confusions is
in other words, a pre-personal
pre and
kind
trans.
of break would be one where I'm really regressing back to, say, when I was 8 years old because something incomplete occurred at that time that I have to go back to. And that's not the same as a real spiritual breakthrough.
No. That's the trouble. There's a confusion between the two, I think. And that's probably a very important area that needs further documentation and investigation so that it can be clarified. But I think we're really on the way to doing that.
Now, in the transpersonal area, though, sometimes I should think it'd be hard to tell. I read a book by an Eastern guru, Mayor Baba, which he talks about the mad musts, or God-intoxicated people. They can't tie their shoelaces, they can't dress themselves, and they have their disciples. They come and feed them, and the disciples somehow recognize these people are very holy. Their consciousness is lost in God, but to another person, they might seem to be so severely retarded.
Yeah. Well, I think I think we need to take the cultural differences into account here.
Yeah.
And that when we're talking about a developmental approach, we're looking at expanding consciousness in a way into higher states. Now, we differentiate higher states from altered states because altered states are simply other states other than our ordinary waking state. And that might include this God intoxication that you're talking about. Higher states include all of the states of all of the faculties of the ordinary waking state, plus additional faculties, so that they have a noetic quality. That means that there's a sense of deeper knowing and understanding, and they also usually have the affect is one of loving kindness, and the motivation that comes out of these experiences tends to be one of service in the world.
And what you seem to be saying, Frances, is that people who are experiencing these higher states have integrated the transpersonal level into their lives, and they're really functioning. What comes to mind is someone like Helen Keller. They're more than just average or normal. They're able to inspire other people and motivate and share with people a sense of enthusiasm.
Yes, I think that's true, but I also think that it's available to all of us, and that we all have moments, if not days and times, when we tap into these states. And so I think that that's what we need to remember, that we all have access to that source of transcendent wisdom within ourselves if we're willing to take the time and give it the attention that it deserves.
To recognize those moments.
Yes.
To catch that spark.
Yes.
Well, Frances, it's been a pleasure sharing that transpersonal spark with you. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure for me too.
And thank you very much for being with us also.